Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Stephanie, and I appreciate y'all stopping by today to spend a small part of your day with me. Today I'll be showing y'all how I made these 5 patriotic themed decor pieces, all for under $5 each. I hope y'all enjoy the video, and if you do, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Let's go ahead and jump right into DIY number 1. For this project, I used 2 of the 8x10 canvases from Dollar Tree. I started by flipping the canvas over and used a utility knife to cut along the outside edges of the staples to remove the canvas from the frame. Once I had the canvas removed from the frame, I removed all the leftover pieces. I then went ahead and very carefully removed the staples from the back side of the frame. I did leave 1 staple in each of the corners. I also left the staples in the corners on the front side of the frame. Next, I painted the frames with 1 coat of Waverly chalk paint in the color white. I did not worry about painting the back side since it would be covered up. I used carbon paper to transfer the words "Party Like It's 1776" that I traced off the computer onto the first canvas. I will leave a link down below of my hand-drawn copies of both of these designs if you want to print them off for use. To get the design ready to transfer, I used some painter's tape and taped the design onto a piece of carbon paper that I had already cut to the correct size. Next, I centered the design between the creases from where the canvas was stretched over the frame and taped it into place using painter's tape. I then used the tip of a mechanical pencil and traced along the words and numbers to transfer the design. If you don't want to use this transfer method, you could freehand the words, use stickers, or vinyl. I prefer to do it this way because I enjoy painting and it relaxes me. I then repeated the same steps using the other design and transferred it to the second canvas. Here's how the 2 canvases looked once the designs had been transferred. I used Waverly chalk paint in the color crimson to paint the large words and letters on both canvases. I did end up painting 2 coats of the crimson paint to cover all the dark lines left by the carbon paper. If I happened to paint outside the lines, I used apple barrel white paint to clean up any edges. Once the crimson paint was dry, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color Ocean to paint the remaining words on both canvases. Again, I used 2 coats of the paint and went back in and cleaned up any messy edges with white paint. Then, to finish off this sign, I centered the frame over the top of the canvas to create a reverse canvas. Once it was centered, I very carefully flipped the frame and canvas over. Then, making sure the canvas was pulled tight, I used a stapler to reattach it to the back of the frame. If you don't have a stapler, you could also use hot glue as it works just as well. To remove the excess canvas from around the frame, I very carefully used a utility knife to cut along the outside edge. I then repeated the steps to attach the frame to the Land of the Free canvas, and this cheap and easy project was finished. I really do love how these signs turned out. I found a similar pair on Wayfair for about $25 each, but I was able to make my own for roughly $1.25 each and some paint and a little bit of time. Moving on to DIY number 2. For this super quick and easy DIY, I started with one of the United States wood cutout color your own decor pieces from Dollar Tree. I used Rust-Oleum stain in the color Kona and gave the cutout 2 heavy coats on the front, back, and sides, making sure to let it dry completely between coats. While that was drying, I took one of these packages of wood letters from the Dollar Tree and used the letters U, S, and A. I used apple barrel paint in the color Flag Red and gave the color U 2 coats, letting it dry well between each coat. I used apple barrel paint in the color White and gave the letter S 2 good coats. I used apple barrel paint in the color Bright Blue and gave the letter A 2 good coats, again letting it dry completely between coats. Once the wood cutout was completely dry, I marked 3 places on the back where it would come into contact with the wreath form and put a piece of cotton twine on each mark using a generous amount of hot glue. Once the glue had dried, I went back and added more hot glue on top for a little added security. I use Gorilla Hot Glue sticks and rarely have any issues when I use it for things like this. For the wreath form in this project, I used one of these red, white, and blue tinsel wreaths from Dollar Tree. I made sure the hanger was facing the top of the wreath and then nestled the United States cutout down inside the wreath, trying to center it the best I could and keeping it straight while making sure the areas that had the twine on them were in contact with the wreath form. Once I had the cutout in place, I flipped the wreath over and tied the twine to the wreath form using triple knots. I did double check after tying each of the 3 places that the wood cutout was still centered and straight. I normally don't like tinsel wreaths, but I feel like for the 4th of July decor, it works because it's so shiny and it reminds me of fireworks. After I had all 3 areas tied to the wreath form, I cut off any of the excess twine. To finish up this project, I flipped the wreath back over and laid the letters U, S, and A diagonally across the wood cutout and used hot glue to secure them in place. And that's it for this super quick and easy project. I think this little wreath turned out super cute. Although it's a bit on the smaller side, it's still a perfect addition to my patriotic decor this year. Alright y'all, let me take a few seconds to tell y'all a little bit about today's video. It's part of the 5 Under 5 playlist that is hosted each month by Missy over at Crafty Cove and Emily over at Farm Charm Chic. This month's theme is Patriotic Home Decor, and this month's guest host is Tammy over at the Rusted Willow. So be sure to check out their channels that are linked down below, and if you want even more patriotic inspiration, check out the playlist that is also linked below in the description box. Y'all won't be disappointed. All the creators on today's playlist are incredibly talented. Now that all that's been said, let's jump into DIY number 3. For this project, I started with one of the wooden star cutouts from Dollar Tree and removed the hanger. I also used 4 of the jumbo skewer sticks from Dollar Tree. I started by cutting off the flat end of the skewer so that all the pieces would have the same type of end. And then I laid the skewer down onto the edge of one of the points on the star and measured out how long the piece should be and marked it with a pencil. I didn't do any specific measuring here, just eyeballing it, because this is supposed to be a more rustic looking project. Once I had the piece marked, I cut it using a pair of wire cutters. After I had the first piece cut, I went ahead and used it as a guide to cut out 30 more pieces, roughly the same size. Again, I wasn't worried about exact measurements. After I had all 30 pieces cut, I used wood glue hot glue sticks and glued 3 of the pieces together. I only used the wood glue on the ends of the sticks, and because the glue dries extremely fast, I glued one end at a time instead of trying to glue them both at the same time. I continued to glue the pieces together in sets of 3 until I had a total of 10 sets. Next, I took the Kona stain and stained the sets with 3 heavy coats, letting it dry well between the coats. To cover the star, I used a piece of this red, white, and blue scrapbook paper that looks like weathered wood that I picked up at Hobby Lobby. I traced the star out on the back of the scrapbook paper and cut it out. Since the star was a little wide for the paper, I used some of the scrap paper and lined it up so that it would match the blue on the area of the star that wasn't covered. I used my fingernail to make a crease so that I could trace out the part of the star that I needed to cover, and then cut it out. Next, I used the Kona stain to stain the sides and back of the star. I did do 2 coats, letting it dry well between coats. For the feet of the tray, I took 5 of the wooden craft cubes from Dollar Tree and stained 5 of the sides, leaving one side unstained. Next, I took satin Mod Podge and applied a very generous layer on the front of the star and placed the pieces of scrapbook paper on top. I made sure to smooth out any lumps or bumps in the paper and, if necessary, add a little more Mod Podge to the points of the star. Once the Mod Podge was dry, I went back with a second generous layer and covered the top of the scrapbook paper to seal it and make sure it was securely in place, and let it dry for a couple of hours. After the Mod Podge was completely dry, I took some sandpaper and went around the edges of the star to remove any excess paper that was hanging over the edge. This will give the edges a nice finished look. Next, I used more of the hot glue wood glue to attach the feet of the tray. I put the glue on the side of the wood cube that I left unstained and put one on each of the 5 points of the star. Once I had the feet in place, I took more of the wood glue and began attaching the wooden sides to the tray. I put wood glue on each end of the wooden piece and put them along the edges of the star until all 10 pieces were in place. I tried to get as close to the edge as possible so that it would give plenty of room on the inside of the tray. You will see that there is a big gap at the very point of the star, but that will be covered up in the next step. Next, I used some thick jute cord and hot glue to cover up the gaps where the pieces meet and on the ends of each point. I used this huge roll of jute that I picked up at Hobby Lobby, and I'm going to say that it probably wasn't even $1's worth of jute for this whole project. To give the sides a little more security and to cover up any areas where the wood glue was visible, I took some more of the jute cord and hot glued it around the inside of the star. Then, to finish off this project, I took some more of the jute cord and hot glued it around the base of the star to help cover up any visible glue and to hide the fact that the wooden star points are not as long as the wooden sides. I also want to mention I did go ahead and burn all the fuzzies off the jute to give it a cleaner, more rustic look. I know this one had a few extra steps, but it was totally worth every one of them. I am absolutely thrilled with how this little tray turned out, and it can be used as a stand-up decor piece if you don't want to use it as a tray. Moving right along to DIY number 4. For this project, I used 2 of these wood plank boards from Dollar Tree. They're roughly 11 inches long and 5.5 inches wide. I wanted the smoothest side to be the front of my sign, so I placed the boards face down and used the wood glue hot glue sticks to glue them together. To give the sign a little added stability and security, I used a stapler and put a few staples along the seam to reinforce where I glued the 2 boards together. Next, I used the One Nation bandana from this 2-pack I picked up at Dollar Tree. I unfolded it and cut out the center square that says One Nation. I made sure to stay on the outside of the thick blue line and to not cut into the wood-looking background. Once I had the piece cut out, I took some matte Mod Podge and applied a generous amount to the top half of the sign using a foam brush to spread it out evenly. Next, I placed the bandana on top, making sure to smooth out all the lumps and bumps with my fingers. I found that when using fabrics, and especially the silky fabrics like this bandana, the easiest way to smooth the bumps is with my fingers. It's messy, but it works best for me. When I had the top part of the bandana glued down, I continued working my way down the rest of the sign in sections, applying a generous layer of the Mod Podge, and then putting the bandana on top and smoothing it out. Once the bandana was fully adhered to the sign, I applied another thick layer of Mod Podge on top and let it dry for about an hour to an hour and a half. To finish off this project, after the sign was completely dry, I took some embroidery scissors and cut off the excess fabric hanging off the edges. I used these small sharp scissors because I wanted to be able to cut as close to the edge of the sign as possible so that it would have a nice finished look. And that's it for this one, y'all. It was super easy, and I think it turned out way better than I could have imagined. I love how the natural look of the pine wood comes through the background to really make this sign pop. This one might actually be my favorite out of today's projects. And last but not least, DIY number 5. For this project, I used 3 pieces off of a 2x2 furring strip that I picked up at Lowe's. The strip was 8 feet long, but I only used about 17 inches of it. I cut it into 3 pieces, one that was 3.5, one that was 6, and one that was 7.5 inches long. I also used the other bandana from the 2-pack from the last project, as well as a piece of the blue strip that was left over. I started by cutting out the pieces I wanted from each of the bandanas that would be just a tad bit bigger than the piece of wood I was putting it on. I cut out some of the blue stars for the smallest piece, Let Freedom Ring for the largest piece, and USA for the medium-sized piece of wood. I did make sure when I was cutting the fabric that it was going to be wide enough to cover the entire piece of wood. Next, I used matte Mod Podge and applied it generously to the front of the block and used a foam brush to spread it out evenly. Then I took the fabric and placed it on top of the wood and smoothed it out with my fingers and allowed it to dry for a few minutes and continued to repeat the process until the entire block was covered with the fabric. Once the block was completely covered, I applied another generous layer of Mod Podge on top of the fabric and allowed it to dry. I worked in sections just as I did when I was putting the fabric on the block. I would coat one side and allow it to dry before moving on to the next side. I'm an impatient crafter, so I use my heat tool here to speed up the process. I then repeated the entire process to put the fabric on the other two blocks. This is how all three blocks looked once they were covered with the fabric and dry. Just like in the last DIY, once the blocks were completely dry, I took the embroidery scissors and cut off the excess fabric on the top and bottom of the blocks. I did leave the top and bottom of the blocks the natural wood color because it matched the decor aesthetic that I'm going for with some of my decor this year. To finish off this project, I took 3 small pieces of jute cord and hot glued one to the top of each block to look like a fuse for the firework. Once the glue was dry on the fuse, I trimmed them down so that they were a little bit shorter, and that was it for this one. I love how quick and easy these were to make, and I think they are absolutely adorable. I can't wait to display them on my entryway table on the star tray that I made in DIY number 3. Here's one final look at all of today's Patriotic home decor DIYs. I absolutely love how all these DIYs came together today, and I can't wait to add them to my decor for the upcoming 4th of July holiday. Which one of these projects is your favorite? Let me know in the comments below. Mine has to be the One Nation sign, although I'm really loving the fireworks too. I want to thank each and every one of you for stopping by, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. It really does help me out here on YouTube. And if you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, what are you waiting for? Click that button and stick around for a while. I have a bunch of fun projects on the way. Please don't forget to go check out the host for today's super fun video linked in the description box below, as well as check out the playlist for even more patriotic decor inspiration. I'll see y'all next time.